But now, ladies and gentlemen, first keynote speaker is Markku Wilenius, who is a professor of futures studies in Turku University Business School. He is also a UNESCO chair in Learning Society and Futures of Education. He has published books and articles widely. For example, his forthcoming book, now in sale, is called Patterns of the Future, Understanding the Next 40 Years of Global Change. Please buy that, find it from somewhere, and welcome him with his song. Ladies and gentlemen, Markku Wilenius.
The way you shock me, the way you move it here, just wanna feel it from you.
Don't be afraid to catch fish.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Very nice to be here in Oulu. I'm sure most of you have heard the miracle of Oulu. What happened after the 90s, actually after the 70s and from there on, that this rather small city grew to be one of those cities that I've always mentioned when we're talking about how fast and expansively a city can grow in modern industrial times. But you know, there are also other miracles here. You know that they have a deep harbor, which is actually on land. They also have a university, which is built on the marshes. And here, in fact, we are on the sea. So, small wonders and big wonders. I have always loved the energy which is here. This, very honestly speaking. It's something very particular, something that we really need to learn from. Like what happened after Nokia/Microsoft did their reductions here. They jumped on to the challenge and started to work on that. And instead of having these 1 or 2 companies, they now have 30 or 40 companies who provide those jobs. So, I have a very easy title, haven't I? Next 100 years, Finland, right? You know why it's easy? Because whatever I claim, you're not going to be here to judge me after 100 years, right? So I can say, for instance, like, wow, yeah, actually after 100 years, Oulu will be not only a capital of Finland, but actually capital of Europe. 20 million people. And I could continue forever, you know. And you have no way to disqualify my claims. Well, I'm not only going to talk about what will happen after 100 years. I'm mostly talking about the way towards 100 years from now. And some of the stuff that you will be hearing from me actually will make you convinced that this place is going to be a capital of Europe in 100 years. Okay, but let's start. Just a few words, because the guy like me is, you know, I have a bit exceptional stuff that I'm working with, because I'm paid for looking on the future. And that means that in order to do that in a proper way, you need to move around in different circles, in different sectors. So not only in this ivory tower of academic world, which is about my professorship, but also a lot of our stuff that I have been working. Just this kind of a warning for what is come. You know what this is? Who recognizes this? Yeah, couple of people. Well, this is from the first movie, which was at the time talking about the utopia. And this utopia was that there are intelligent machines. The movie was called Space Odyssey 2001. It was filmed 1968. And it was actually talking about the relationship between machines and people. This will be, as we all know, a very integral part of our future. Now, this machine is telling to Dave, which is outside in the space, wanted to go into the spaceship, that, sorry, I can't open the doors. I leave you to the space. So it was kind of presenting a dystopia. But we know that the future is much richer than that type of a utopia or dystopia. But let's start. Let's look at that. What has happened in industrial times up until this point? The issue is that the development that has occurred in the last 200 years is not random. It's not a continuum. It's rhythmic. So not only the nature outside this building performs rhythmic, but also our societies, our technologies, our economies, our social systems, our cultures works also in rhythmic ways. This was something that I detected while I was strategic head of Allianz, which is the most largest insurance company in the world, private. And it was 2008. What happened 2008? We all know. It was financial crisis. What happened? That was exactly the question. In the offices in Munich at that time, and everywhere around the world. And the point was that no one understood. Or maybe there were one or two, but we didn't listen to those guys. This shows one or two things. First of all, it shows that there had not that many people that had this type of a perspective. In Finnish we say, nähdä metsä puilta, which is to see the forest from the trees. And this is what we mostly are actually doing. We are confined into our own worlds. And that's why we don't see when things are coming. Sometimes they are coming inside our world, but it's unfamiliar to our experience. Or they come from outside, from other sources, and we are not prepared to listen to them, these signals. That's why this business of future is not that simple, yet it's not impossible. It becomes impossible if you try to claim that you know particular events in the future to happen. Because those sources of information to know about that, we don't get into those spaces, those information spaces at the moment. I wouldn't claim that they would not exist, because time is also a mental construct. But for the time being, it's pretty hard. Now, this succession of development waves in our societies suggests something for the future. And my suggestion is that based on what we have learned up until this point, the next phase is really about how do we deal with materials, energy, and human capital. Because in all these spheres, we have huge efficiency gains to be made. if you just simply look how our societies are built, how the ownership is spread into the society and in the economics as we know today, you see that from the system's point of view, it doesn't make sense. Let's start from the obvious example. 24 hours per day. So how many of those hours you are using your car, which you own? 1%? 2%? Some can even have a 5%. Does that make sense? From efficiency point of view? No, of course not. We need those cars, probably in the future too. But we don't need to own them, because that builds up the inefficiency to our systems. And you can go on an endless insight of how in various parts, in all parts of our society, we see this same inefficiency, which has been building faster and faster. So if anybody asks, why on earth we are currently in the situation in our societies, like in Finland, that we have been having a pretty much an average 3% GDP growth over the 100 years, or actually a bit more, with the result that, yes, we have accumulated some wealth, but we are very much indebted as well. Particularly if we start to take into account those debts that do not account in our national or organizational books. Now, this is the reason why we are all the time heading towards more intelligent solutions. And this gathering is all about that. And the complexity around this, I try to show it in a little bit, but even this is a much too simplified version of that. But basically what we always have when we look at the future, when we look at what's happening next, we need to understand something about the megatrends, those big driving forces that pushes us, regardless of our business, they push us to certain issues, certain dilemmas, and certain opportunities, of course, as well. And then, as a response, we are building certain platforms, and this is what we see now happening. But none of this platform building wouldn't be possible to come up or happen if we don't have that basis. The basis which is awareness and consciousness of people based on the education, learning, and their access to information. And suddenly we start to see different things. We start to be worried about the environmental concerns, and we start to see the complexity of the world in a very different way. Because again, if you look at take the long history of humankind, every time a system grows too complex, it decays. It rattles down. And this is also true sometimes in our personal lives. Now, the next phase of globalization is particularly interesting because we see a turn of 200 years of trend. This trend has two phases. First of all, the sources of our economic growth are changing very rapidly. And we're going to touch upon that later in my presentation. The second thing is that because this old growth doesn't help us anymore in such a way that it has helped in the past, we also have this tidal change between different parts of the world. Which means that in basically, after this next wave, this next 40 years, we're going to be in a situation where the OECD countries are placed in the same position that non-OECD countries are right now, roughly speaking. While at the same time, we have this situation where from next 10 years, we're going to see this true connectedness of our global system and the people inside that system. And when we see that emerging, it means that suddenly the way we are behaving as individuals, as groups, as nations, has much wider ramifications. That is particularly because if we think about the resource efficiency, which is actually a resource flows in many ways, and we look what happened, again, taking a long look back, what happened was that we were pushing the commodity prices in our industrial societies as much as we could downwards to enable industrial growth. And the result of that is partly what I was saying earlier. It hasn't helped us to build the efficiency in that we truly need, not only to produce economic growth, but to master our societal and environmental problems. Now, this chart shows also that when something remarkable takes place, the curve changes its direction. So, what was this? What happened in this green star point that made these commodity prices to jump? Any guesses? Come on, it's not so difficult or serious or whatever. What was that? 9/11. No, not 9/11. No, Europe. A little thing called China. Because at that particular point in time, China emerged in the global markets in such a way that the demand was simply driven up with this type of the result. Now, the point is here that even though we have seen now a downward trend because the global economy has been more or less in a recession after the financial occurred, is the trend still there? I believe at some point this trend is coming back there. It's picking up that, which is another signal that if we are going to go on that same old path, it's no good for us because we have to change that politics. Now, there is an obvious need in the world to actually provide, and the nations to provide services for its people, which means that the demand growth will be there in the coming decades. While at the same time, we have this type of issue at hand. This is our most precious resource on earth, water. So what's happening with water? Well, if we are here in Oulu, more water in the future. For the most part, less water. You see this simulation, and you see those dark red, violet areas in the globe. And that means that they are in hell of a trouble in the future if we are going to continue this path of warming up. And of course, the side effects of all of this will be massive also to us, particularly because it's not only about the water, it's really about what's happening in terms of fluxes in global climate. This shows to you something very interesting. It shows how much more extremes we are going to experience, weather extremes we are going to experience at the end of this century under the business as usual scenario which we are heading right now. Again, telling, not everybody will be in such a trouble, particularly if you come into northern latitudes, but the indirect consequences going to be almost as harsh to us as they are for those regions near the equator, near the middle of this graph. And so the situation is the following. If you look at the relationships in our world, there are many relationships. And one of the key relationships is what's happening between human and carbon. And this graph shows that when we are heading towards higher income countries, and we are building on that, in the past that has meant that they are more carbon producing as well. And that is the problem. The problem is us, the problem is not those countries with low income. Which means that actually when you think about this and who are actually the ones that need to act in order not these triggering events to happen in the future, triggering events in our global system, biosphere, weather system, then it's really us to do something about that. Because, again, we know from the past, Stone Age didn't end because of there were no stones anymore. And this is the same thing with the oil. So the question is that actually the price of the last barrel doesn't matter. If we are there, we are too far. And the fact is that if you look at those trends that tell that actually those old sources, again, those old sources of industrial growth, in which the oil has been the most important material for that. When we are running out of the easy sources and we have this additional contextual issue of environment, that makes it that already now you can see that actually the markets are changing because they are recognizing this. So in such a way, we are almost like living now in the period of threshold, where we see a lot of market actors, a lot of financial actors. Remember, in the end of the 80s, financial economy was a fraction of the size it is today, and has grown with no comparison to our material industrial growth. Which means also that when we look what's happening on the intangible side, there is a lot. There has already been a revolution that has taken place, which we can detect from this graph, for instance. So it's actually mind-blowing to think that we have been already seeing all this change happening, which is preparing us for the next 50 or for the next 100 years. And now we have new medias, new tools that are generating growth, but it is also generating a very new kind of societal issues and problems. Where do we find the jobs of tomorrow? Whose job can be replaced by artificial intelligence? Quite a few of those jobs can be replaced. Already, some research proves that. And we are already starting to experience that. So, when we look at that evolution that takes from here on, we can clearly see that actually something very fundamental is happening. And this very fundamental is not only a technological issue, it's as much of the issue of what happens when all these different technology developments merges into a new kind of a combination, which is exactly something which I wish that we are exploring in this conference here today. Now, what is magnificent in all this development is that, again, something of the turn of the tide has occurred in terms of thinking that whether we are going more into a focused, centralized-led systems or distributed systems. And now we see that distributed intelligence and organization taking place everywhere, which wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, leave alone 20 years ago. And we need to ask ourselves why this is happening right now. Well, it's happening because there is a communication that happens in between different subsystems, which make them much more effective than centralized-led systems. And that's what we already experience in our working life, which is dramatically changing the ways that we see and observe our qualifications. So my students in Turku, we are talking a lot about what are those types of qualifications that are needed in the future labor market, which is not anymore this old ways of looking that, well, let's build a qualification according to a job description, which is already there in the market. Now, the interesting point is that when we start to observe what really matters in the organization, so various kinds, it takes us back to what we are as human beings. And there are basically three things which we are really concerned about. Are we able to use our creativity? Are we able to learn new things? Are we able to have an impact in that system where we're living? In our times, people that are educated, understand things, require all these three things to happen in their own lives. And we did some interesting sort of investigation on that, which I don't have a time to go through now. But anyway, that's also a sign for the new. Well, what's interesting is also that this machine intelligence, which is building up these new businesses, is something which we have seen under the last 3 to 4 years, dramatic growth. Again, hardly to detect what's going on. But let's have another example in a very nutshell. How does intelligent cities look like? This is actually a project that I did in Turku, which is about the same size as Oulu. So we started to think what the intelligent city should look like in 2050. And we started to reclaim the city in a very different way. So that, for instance, the city as a system, as a transportation system, is not anymore led like this, but it's led like this and organized like this, having a systemic view of how actually you rearrange the city to be actually more human-focused. Which means that in this type of the scene that we still see when at this, not at this time, but maybe a little bit later, in the middle, heart of the Turku, could look like this. So this is a metaphor that I'm now talking to you, because I want to show you that actually whatever system you're looking at, you always find that now, if we take this truly human approach and integrate our technology into that in the right way, we create a very different type of society. And Turku might still, after 1 year, this is 2050, and someone said, well, what's the difference of today? Well, I could show a lot of difference. You know, those of you, particularly you've been there, you probably recognize something. But anyway, a lot of that is still the same. Now, this is same true for Finland. If we think about where we're heading, how do we take advantage of the good stuff that we have been created in this very rapid expansion period we had from 1970s on? We are currently in a great problem because simply there has been a kind of a backlash from all this good and success that we had. Now, we need to build business very differently. And building business, this is one exercise that we have been doing in Turku, which is, in a sense, building a platform where people and businesses can meet. And at the very end, I'm going to show you 3 very short examples of those types of new things that we have been generating in Turku, which all reflects all these 3 critical domains I mentioned in the morning. So energy resource efficiency, many of you are also in your companies performing that. But what's really interesting with this company, for instance, is the fact that actually so much of that manufacturing, which they are also doing, has to do with creating a new services, exactly to help customers to decrease their energy use. The next example comes from a company called eRent, which is a very, very intelligent way of taking care that your own equipments, and this is basically meant for construction industry, but it can expand to anywhere. You can take care of your own equipments plus the rented equipments in a nice and easy way, because everything is trackable. So you always know where they are, whether they are in use or not. A great example of how to use machine intelligence in building a much more efficient way of using your assets. And the last one is really about what do we do with the human resources in such a way that we can focus on our work while the others take care, like this company, of how we actually build this business around. How do we take the next steps? Who is helping us to do that? And they have this wonderful kasvattamo, where they're actually helping these new companies exactly to focus on their own business, but helping them by creating everything else that enables them to make their next steps. So all of this is just the other way of saying that actually when we're going towards circular economy, in one way or another, we suddenly start to see a world in a very different way. Our systems, our structures, our legislations is not there in place as yet. Neither our financiers are not on the track with this really. But it's going to come. And it's going to come very fast. More of that I'll tell you in my books if someone is interested. And now I just thank you for your attention. Thank you.